Good afternoon. It's just afternoon, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Helen Avery with the Green Finance Institute. We're just going to give a couple of minutes for everybody to join. We had quite a few people sign up for this, so I just want to leave it a couple of minutes. While you are joining, we have a very short poll, if you wouldn't mind just filling it in. And that is, we're just trying to understand what your level of engagement is with the TNFD framework. So whether it's your first engagement, whether you're familiar with the framework, but have not yet begun planning around disclosures, we appreciate it's very early days and the framework hasn't launched yet. It's still in development. Your organisation is planning to disclose via the TNFD, but has not yet incorporated TNFD considerations into operational decisions. And then the fourth option here on this poll is that you have incorporated TNFD considerations already into operational decisions. Okay, so I think we'll just leave the poll up for a couple of minutes while people are joining, and I'm just going to give a brief introduction to the session today. So as I mentioned, I'm Helen Avery. I'm head of nature programs at the Green Finance Institute. As you may know, we host the Secretariat to the Task Force for Nature-related Financial Disclosures and the UK National Consultation Group. So the aim of the National Consultation Group is really just to ensure that as many UK corporates as possible are familiar with the Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosures. They know how to engage with the framework, know how to feed back it via the portal and the consultation process that I'll talk through in a moment, that they're learning from their peers. This session really is designed to provide information specifically for the textile and apparel sector in the UK, and it's a very informal introductory session. There will be a follow-up session towards the end of April and early May that will be more of a sort of deep dive for those that are interested on the sort of final beta release of the framework and looking to feed back directly into the TNFD, but I'll talk about that a bit later. But this is a lunch and learn, and we're very fortunate to be joined by a few people who are going to share with us their expertise. I'm going to be joined later by Phil Townsend, who is the Senior Technical Manager in Environmental Sustainability at Primark, who's going to be sharing their journey into nature-related risks, and also Philip Herkire, VP of Marketing and Sustainability Officer at HiQ. So they're going to be sharing a bit about their experience as they start to look at nature-related risks and some of the lessons learned, and that's going to be followed by a short Q&A. If you have any questions, please do type them into the Q&A function. We will be recording each webinar, this webinar, and to also generating a fact sheet for you afterwards. So you can look forward to that. But before we invite Phil and Philip to join us, however, we wanted to give you some background on the TNFD and the framework development so far. So very fortunate to be joined here by Andrew Mitchell. He's one of the co-founders of the TNFD and is vice chair of the stewardship group. So he's going to be sharing a few words on why the TNFD is so important and a bit about the history for those who aren't aware of it. And then I'm going to walk through a sort of 10-minute short presentation before our panel of where we are in the TNFD framework, some of the key dates ahead, and how you can get more engaged. So the TNFD really is the brainchild of Andrew, and while he refers to himself as a co-founder, it really wouldn't exist without him. So we're just so grateful to have him with us today. So over to you, Andrew.
Helen, look, thank you for those kind words. Of course, a huge number of people have contributed to making the TNFD get to where it is today, but my perspective is longer than most in that I've been working at the conservation front line around the world for almost 50 years. And I started out life as a zoologist, not as an industrialist or anything like that. And but my area that I've looked at is natural capital as opposed to financial capital. And one thing you notice when you've been working around the world in so many different areas over such a long time, is the terrible depletion of natural capital that we've seen, not only in our oceans, but for me, it was mainly in tropical forests, which was an area that I specialized in, and seeing the rollback of forests, mainly for the creation of quite a small number of commodities, beef, soy, paper pulp, palm oil, and those sort of things around the world, is something that is truly devastating. And these things have consequences, and they're coming back to haunt us now. And so the pollution of our atmosphere is triggering climate change, but the degradation of nature is something which the climate crisis, in a sense, accelerates. And these two things are coupled, they work together. Nature is like large-scale infrastructure that helps to keep the earth safe. So don't think just about pollination and butterflies and bees and things like this. We're talking about very large-scale infrastructure that's hugely important. And of course, global economies depend upon it. And there have been a slew of reports coming out in recent years explaining the detail of how nature's loss will impact economies. And the World Economic Forum a few years ago came up with a headline figure of about, over half of our global GDP was highly dependent or moderately dependent on nature. In fact, it's probably more likely 100%, because of course, if you took away nature, there wouldn't be an economy. And so eco has always been in economy. And I think that the apparel sector is a really interesting one in this story, because as you'll be aware, you're intimately connected for a number of reasons with services that come from nature, and not least in the production of raw materials, natural or synthetic. Natural materials, of course, cotton, wood, pulp, rubber, leather, all of these sorts of things underpin the apparel industry, but also huge amounts of petrochemicals as well that create the feedstocks for synthetic clothing and synthetic products in the industry. So these two basic areas are really important because of farmland. And of course, we understand how the expansion of farming, if not done well, the erosion of the productivity of the soil over time is a huge concern. Droughts, floods, all of these things affect the ability to create the raw materials that go into the industry. And then, so you can get affected operationally through the markets, through changing regulatory systems. There's a reputational risk here. Actually, I think a lot of this nature stuff is, in a sense, I sometimes talk about this to investors, because having started out as a zoologist, I used to hug trees and orangutans, and I kind of find myself hugging asset managers and bankers these days. And they're the ones who need educating, because it's about this huge flow of money. And when talking to them about why nature is so important, I think it will go a similar way to things like child labor in the apparel industry. If you ask most investors today, are you still investing in companies that employ child labor? There'll be a lot of foot shuffling and hand wringing, but of course, no is the answer. But probably a decade ago, they might have been, or they might not have known whether they were or they weren't. And I think nature will go the same way. A lot of people who ask a pension fund, are you destroying rainforests with your pension fund, for example? They wouldn't know how to answer that. They wouldn't be able to. They don't have the data, the mechanism, nor did they even feel there's a regulatory prerogative, which means that they should have to answer that. But all that is changing fast. The European Union is introducing new laws which will make it illegal to import commodities into the European Union that are connected to deforestation or illegal fishing for that matter. And the UK is looking at the same kind of laws, so that the regulatory framework is tightening very fast. And of course, for those of you in the apparel industry, we'll have to sit up and think about this, because of course you are importing a lot of commodities that are coming into the European Union. Are these involved with things like deforestation or the degradation of nature? The legal frameworks on this are going to be tightening. So that is why we thought that it would be a good idea to set up a reporting and disclosure, or a risk management and reporting framework for nature. Now, some of you will be familiar with the TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, which was set up by Mark Carney and Michael Bloomberg a number of years ago, coupled with the Paris Agreement on Climate in 2015. And a number of us thought that it would be a good idea to try the same trick, if you like, with nature, because the limitation of the TCFD is that it's just about carbon. And there are many other things that we need to consider and take into account beyond carbon, and that's what the TNFD is doing. So it looks at water, forests, landscapes, oceans, all of that. But the methodology is very similar to that of the TCFD, as you will hear in a moment. So if you're already thinking about TCFD for climate, I think you will be comfortable with the framework that the TNFD is developing. So we thought that by coupling the TNFD with COP15 of the UN Convention on Biodiversity, which was far less well known than the one on climate, by putting those two things together, we might get a similar raise in interest and momentum behind the TNFD. I have to say, I was completely overwhelmed by how much interest there is in TNFD. It has gone in 1 year to more downloads than the TCFD framework in 1 year than they've had in 5. We've had an astonishing amount of interest and support, not only from the financial sector, but also the corporate sector, who want to lean in and help make this as good as it can be. And I'm extremely grateful to those of you who've taken the time today to join this call. I hope you'll find it interesting. This is something we all have to do, whether we like it or not. I know a lot of people think too much time on disclosure, it's getting expensive, and ESG, there's a lot of pushback on that, but it's not going to go away, because if we don't change the movement of money, we will finance ourselves into extinction. That's the raw truth that bankers, asset managers, pension funds, and so on are having to address. We have to find a better way to lighten our footprint on the earth through our finance and through our companies. And I think everyone agrees with that. We just need a guidebook to get us through this maze. And that's what the TNFD is going to offer. So I'm going to hand over now back to Helen, and look forward to this discussion. And thank you all so much for joining.
Thank you so much, Andrew. It's such a pleasure to see you as always, and thank you for that rallying cry. So I'm going to walk through now for about 10 minutes. I'm going to whiz through them. There are some slides, and the aim of the slides is just to give you a bit of an overview of what the TNFD is and where we are, and then touch on some of what the relevance is to the textiles and apparel industry. And then we'll be bringing our panelists on to really hear from them and bring it to life. So while it is a bit of a whiz through, I know just from the poll that 50% of you, this is your first engagement, and then the rest have sort of started to engage, and one company here has already gone as far as to start incorporating some of the learnings of TNFD into their operations. So it might be a bit basic for some, it might be a little bit complex for some, but we'll see how we go. There is so much information available on the TNFD site. We'll be posting all the links that you'll need in the chat, so you can have a look at the site and work your way around. But basically, as Andrew said, the task force launched in October 2021. There's actually now almost 1,000 forum members globally, and forum members are those who are sort of advocates of the TNFD. They've signed up to the forum, which means that you get webinars, you get emails with all the framework releases, you'll be connected with your national consultation groups, and you can understand how you can more easily interact and offer feedback. So there's already almost 1,000 of those globally. There are 40 individual task force members that are working on developing the task force right now. And there's also Data Catalyst, which has over 100 nature-related data providers who are all working to understand, do we have the data out there? How can we provide it in a way that allows companies to assess and then report on their nature-related impacts and dependencies? And as Andrew mentioned, the goal of the TNFD is it's not a standard, it's actually to provide a framework for disclosure. And ultimately, what we'd like to come out of the TNFD, that it supports a redirection of global financial flows away from activities that harm nature and towards activities that benefit nature. And we all know that you can't manage what you don't measure. So if we have the next slide, please. Thank you. I know there's always a bit of a delay on these Zooms. So just some key milestones for you. We've already had 3 beta releases out. You can access them on the TNFD site. I'll go over a little bit of some of the findings from those releases. Upcoming on the 28th of March will be the 4th and final beta release. There's going to be some sector and biome-specific guidance. There'll be some updates to the draft disclosure, some metric and scenarios, and it'll be building on some of the relevant aspects of the global biodiversity framework that was agreed at COP15. So there will be then a 60-day consultation period. So this really is an opportunity for you to feed in and feedback to the TNFD and help build the framework, which is why we're really hoping to reach as many UK corporates as possible over this period to say, this is your chance. There are things that aren't working for you in it, or there are things that you think need to happen within the framework. This is your chance to feedback. So that will be happening until the 1st of June. And then in September, the TNFD will be finalised and the full framework will be released towards the end of September. We appreciate that it's an iterative process and sector guidance will be built upon and the TNFD frame will be built upon, but this really is your period to really have your say. So do get engaged if you can. I'll tell you how you can get engaged in a moment. So if we could have the next slide, please. So what are the pillars of TNFD and what are their recommendations? As Andrew mentioned, there is an alignment with TCFD. So in response to very clear calls from market participants for this consistent integrated approach to sustainability reporting, the TNFD's draft disclosure recommendations build on those already recommended by the TCFD. So they follow the TCFD's 4 pillars of disclosure: governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. So if you are in a position within your firm who's reporting on TCFD, these will be very familiar to you. There are also 4 new recommendations that have been added. I'm not going to go through them now, but I just kind of wanted to let you know sort of a high level of what the disclosures are going to be and the recommendations so far. Again, these are all still open to your feedback. If we could have the next slide, please. What's also been released is some specific sector guidance. Sector guidance is also coming out, as I mentioned, in March and will also be coming out after March. For textiles and apparel, I was told this morning by the TNFD team, they're expecting that specific sector guidance to come out sometime in June. Energies and extractives and a couple of other sectors are coming out on March the 28th. But there is still a bit of time before you'll get some very specific guidance for your sector. However, it's still plenty of time to feed back into the overall beta framework that that consultation period over April and May that I discussed. In addition to sector-specific guidance, there's also realm-specific guidance that you'll find in the TNFD literature in the framework, in the beta frameworks that have been released so far. And it's just sort of provide a foundation of understanding nature. For many of us, and probably less for you than for me, I'm sure you're more familiar with it coming from your sector, it is very new. And so they've created this wonderful periodic table of different biomes that can help you think through actually what are the exposures that you might be having to which of the different biomes. So next slide, please. So the relevance of TNFD to apparel and textiles, you'll be more familiar with this than I'm sure I am. So in terms of impacts, just an example put here, with water pollution from garment dyeing and synthetic fibre production, and why that might be materially important. Just following on from what Andrew said, perhaps loss of revenue due to reputational damage or fines. There might be expensive restoration projects. In terms of dependencies, could be direct physical inputs, such as groundwater, most likely natural fibres that you'll be dependent on. And the risk there, or the material importance, is that there's, a possibility that there could be reduced availability of that water or natural fibres. And the TNFD framework focuses on both risk and opportunities. So opportunities within the sector could be working with suppliers to maybe adopt regenerative agriculture approaches or traceability when sourcing natural fibres. And some of the risks, obviously, weather patterns, is not that's not a new thing, but will be increasingly so, we expect, that could result in poor crops, which could lead to supply chain disruption and product loss. We could have the next slide, please. So one of the tools that many companies are using, and you may be familiar with it already, is the Encore tool. So we've taken the Encore tool here and applied it to the apparel and textiles. We'll put the link in for the Encore tool into the chat. And it just will highlight some of the impacts and dependencies for your sector, upstream, midstream and downstream. So we've put this here just to sort of give you an illustration, you'll be familiar with these perhaps, that some of the impacts upstream could be around water use, terrestrial ecosystems, synthetic fibers, or equally water use, sometimes water pollutants. In terms of dependencies, there could be high risk from flood and storm potential or disease, also surface water and groundwater exposure. And then downstream, we have obviously disposable waste challenges and sales and distribution. There could be climate, carbon, GHG emissions, for example, again, weather-related challenges and risks. But it's a really useful tool if you haven't started to look around it already, just to get you familiar with what you might be looking at in terms of impacts and dependencies. I'm sure we'll pick up with Phil and Philip in a moment of what they're looking at. So the LEAP approach, you will be hearing a lot about as you get engaged within TNFD. LEAP stands for Locate, Evaluate, Assess and Prepare. And it's just an approach to help assess nature-related risks. So locate, obviously, initially you'll be locating what your key interfaces are with nature. Then you'll be evaluating from that, what are your dependencies and impacts on nature based on those locations. And then moving from just sort of an assessment of what your exposure is to actually what is the risk and the opportunities of that exposure, dependencies and impacts. And then P is for preparing to respond and then report on the TNFD recommended disclosures. So it's called the LEAP framework. It's already been used by 130 institutions to complete pilot assessments. And again, it's being tested, and some of that feedback will be in the beta release number 3 that's out on the 28th of March. So how to engage with the UK National Consultation Group. As I mentioned, we host the UK National Consultation Group. We're very fortunate to be supported by KPMG, and we'll be hearing from Lauren Wethenden later, who's Associate Director for Nature and Biodiversity at KPMG. You can become a member of the National Consultation Group. It costs nothing. We don't require anything from you other than you sign up to the TNFD forum. Then they will send us your details. You can also just CC us in when you do that. You literally just have to say who from your organisation you would be a couple of key contacts for the TNFD forum. And then what we'll do is we obviously offer these information webinars. We'll be doing more deep dive roundtables over the next 2 months ahead of that June 1st cutoff date for feedback. You can contact us at any time and we'll help you direct you to tools you might need or peers in your industry that maybe you can learn from. We'll be providing FAQs, and we have a newsletter that goes out as well. So you can just join by, as I say, joining the TNFD forum, and you can email tnfdncg@gfi.green. We'll also put that in the chat. You can find more information about that too on our website, which is greenfinanceinstitute.co.uk/hive. Again, that will go in the chat. And as I mentioned, there'll be an in-person roundtable in late April, May, where we'll pull together those of you who are wanting to engage more and offer some feedback back into the framework together, and we can sort of collectively take that feedback from you. You can also just provide your feedback via the portal. We'll also put a link to that in the chat as well. So there's a very user-friendly portal that you can use as you're reading through the beta frameworks to fill in your feedback. So I'm going to stop there and go to Philip and Phil, because I always think this is where it all sort of comes to life a bit, and the slides can be a bit overwhelming, and we will share those slides with you. So a very warm welcome, Phil and Philip, and thanks for being our pioneers and our guinea pigs. I think just to frame, this is a very early stage, isn't it? We haven't even had the final framework. So we've had a few of these webinars, and we always make this disclaimer of, we're not expecting people to say, well, we've already done it and this is how we did it. It's more of a how you starting your journey. So Phil, perhaps we can just start with your work at Primark. Maybe initially, could you just tell us, what's the journey been like from moving perhaps from climate to looking at nature, or was nature already there and you've taken a deeper dive? Like, how have you sort of started looking at impacts and dependencies?
Yes, thank you, and thanks for the invitation to join the session today. Well, I can say that biodiversity is incredibly important to Primark. And I mean, firstly, we've acknowledged that not enough has been done by the fashion industry to address biodiversity loss. And we all know that nature urgently needs our help. So we've been accelerating our ambition to become a more sustainable business anyway, since the strong foundations were laid down by our ethical and environmental teams some 15 years ago. And in 2021, we released our Primark Cares sustainability strategy, which was launched with 9 public commitments across 3 pillars of planet, people and product. And we've made a public commitment to help restore biodiversity, which really forms an integral part of that planet pillar set of commitments, alongside our commitment to halve our carbon footprint and reduce waste. And we know, obviously now, more and more that biodiversity and climate are 2 sides of the same coin, really. So it follows that nature and biodiversity can clearly help support climate adaptation and resilience. So we've recognised the need to integrate biodiversity more and more into our broader environmental programmes, and that we know mitigation without the appropriate guardrails can result in negative trade-offs potentially for nature and biodiversity. So we know we need to ensure that we've got a really integrated thought process, and ultimately we've got coherent decision making to underpin that.
So in terms of TNFD, what's your sort of level of engagement so far? We just saw the Encore tool. Is that something you've been using? Are there other tools that you might recommend?
Well, we've focused our attention on our own sustainable cotton program in the first instance. So we actually did a risk assessment, a biodiversity risk assessment across our entire business to see where our priorities needed to be. And that zeroed in firmly on the sort of the tier 4 part of our supply chain, so raw material production. And within that, cotton stood out as a potential risk. So we knew there were impacts from our cotton sourcing. It's our biggest raw material. And so we focused in on our own sustainable cotton program, which has been running for many years. We worked with a consultancy called Biodiversify on developing effectively a biodiversity monitoring framework, which will help us to assess and measure the state of biodiversity on and around some of our sustainable cotton farms. And that's really been developed to be aligned with the high-level guidance on how to measure biodiversity, and obviously TNFD has been a key reference point for that, as well as other emerging frameworks like the Science-Based Targets for Nature, etc. So we continue to follow the progress of the development of TNFD with great interest, of course, and we look forward to seeing how TNFD will be able to support, businesses like Primark in understanding how nature impacts our financial performance and the longer term financial risks that may result from how businesses impact nature. So it's very much been at the heart of our thinking as we've moved forward with our programme.
Thanks, Bill. And I'll come back to you in a moment to talk about sort of challenges and tips for your peers as you're starting this journey. But Philip, maybe turning to you now with a similar vein of questions. How did your journey commence? Was it from climate into nature? If you could sort of talk us through what your current thinking is around nature and some things you're doing.
Yeah. Well, thanks for having me. Well, maybe we are not a well-known brand as Primark. Just quickly tell you what IQ is. We are a company with headquarters in Switzerland. We are listed in London, a public company. 270 people of a big variety, diversity, more than 30 nationalities across the globe. And what our ambition is actually to replace synthetics by natural products, natural and renewable fibers, bio-based chemistry, going away from synthetic chemistry, and also using probiotics, good bacteria, for functions that are now taken care of by synthetic chemistry, basically. We want to make a quantum leap, so not just scratching the surface a little bit, and we do that as an enabler. So we develop, produce, and ingredient brand chemistry. But one of our bigger projects is Ionic, where we are making a yarn made of cellulose, which is nature's most abundant polymer available. So in our statement is that instead of recycling polyester, we have to replace it, because if you recycle it, you are still faced with the microplastics, you are still faced with the problems. And it's a much better alternative to have renewable, natural, and biodegradable raw materials Of course, we will have to invest at scale if we ever want to make green affordable or as affordable as synthetic products. Investment at scale is really necessary, so we have to make a big impact. And I guess that kind of answers the question. Yes, we have always been involved with nature. Everything we do in innovation has double focus, functionality, of course, for to improve the quality of everyday products that people are using. And the second big driver is sustainability, eco-friendliness. I did like the quote earlier by Andrew that eco has always been in economy, definitely a fact. So yes, we are totally involved, going into that more natural, more renewable and sustainable direction.
Are there any particular how are you thinking about the TNFD? Is this quite early for you in looking at the framework? Are you looking at science-based targets for nature as well, or other tools beyond Encore? I was thinking of the WWF biodiversity risk tool that I'll try and have a quick look for at the moment and put in the chat. So how any of those how are you getting engaged?
Well, of course, every initiative, green taxonomy or reporting initiative is helpful to us because we are an enabler to the industry, right? And the more awareness we see, the more awareness we get, the more action will hopefully follow, because I think we have to go now, definitely have to go from the stage of awareness to the field of action. If you take a parallel with the energy sector, also there, I think we have been waiting far too long before we have invested in scale. Now it's finally happening. The tipping point is there. I think also in the textile industry, because we are one of the most polluting industries, it's high time that we start doing things. And then definitely these frameworks, these reporting initiatives do help. I think what is also nice is that, for instance, when you're listed on the London Stock Exchange, there's a mandatory reporting requirement on energy and carbon. For me personally, that could go a little bit further. We know that also GRI, the Global Reporting Initiative, is developing standards specifically for textiles and apparel. We have applied to be in the penholder committee there to help develop the standard. So all these together will hopefully push finance people, but also corporates into the direction of change.
Mm-hmm. And just so everyone's aware, the TNFD has a very close working relationship with the Science-Based Targets for Nature and GRI, and also the IESSB as well, which is expanding its remit to cover nature now. And some of you will be aware that in Target 15 of the Global Biodiversity Framework that was signed by the 196 countries in December, COP15 was a commitment to sort of move towards companies reporting on their nature-related impacts and dependencies. So coming back to you, Phil, what is obviously the point of these webinars is to sort of help people just start to get on that journey of looking at their impacts and dependencies. What are some of the sort of tips you might have, or the challenges that you've seen in that journey, and any sort of tools that you might be using at Primark?
Yes, well, there are quite a few challenges. I think the first thing really is to know where to start, because it can seem a bit overwhelming. But I think it's important to take a step back and understand, why biodiversity matters to your business, and where it is you want to intervene. And clearly, biodiversity does present a material risk to businesses, and has the potential to disrupt, supply chains if you don't start to take action. So I think it's really important to make that aware to your boardroom, your senior leadership team. Biodiversity can still seem like a bit of an abstract concept. So I think it really helps to frame that up as the business risk and the material risk that it presents. But then in terms of the frameworks, I think it's important to understand which frameworks can support you on that journey. And clearly we've mentioned, or I've mentioned earlier, that TNFD has been a great support in helping us develop our biodiversity surveying methodology. But maybe it's important not to align to just one framework, but to look at all of those that are emerging, because there's a lot of synergy there, as you've just mentioned. But it's important to make sure you're in step with all of those, rather than just having a single approach, perhaps. But I think the complexity is familiar to us all. And whilst we've prioritized our approach based on risk, we're also looking right across our supply chain and our own operations. So we're now starting to build several strands of work which will continue to evolve across not just supply chain, but our own operations as well. So I think, again, once you get started, I think you can start to see how it can develop into a much more holistic strategy. I think there's the kind of added challenge of being too reliant on maybe proxy measures or general environmental impact KPIs alone to reflect positive biodiversity trends. And I think we recognise that it's very important to be at the sharp end of where your business is having those impacts, and by measuring directly what's happening on the ground. And I think that's why we've been working to develop a survey methodology that we can apply, as I say, on the farms within our sustainable cotton programme, and working with experts like Biodiversify and also our implementing partners such as Cotton Connect. But even then, the local trends and patterns from biodiversity will emerge over a long period of consistent surveying. And there will be external influences which may or may not be easy to mitigate. So, this is a long-term investment, a long-term program. Biodiversity restoration is not going to be a straight line journey, which is why Primark is pressing ahead with its monitoring program. And I think, as I say, I would encourage companies to just start and get busy with this straight away. I think in terms of recommendations that you suggested, I think it's important to have the relevant subject matter experts to provide guidance on this subject. As I mentioned, we've been working with Biodiversify for about 3 years now, but also, local partners are going to have to bring their level of expertise to this as well. So I think there's going to have to be a real network of partnerships and collaborations to help deliver some real results here that we all need. And I think that risk assessment for us was really key, just to kick off and give us a sense of focus across our entire business as to where our significant impacts are likely to be. And then it starts to make the whole process look a little bit less daunting, and it gives you a clear set of priority areas to work on. So I think find the right expertise and get started on your journey would be my advice.
Great, thank you. And Philip, what about yourself? Any tips that you have or challenges? And also, are you looking at the framework and feeding back in? Just sort of interested to sort of hear your level of engagement.
Yeah, I think where to start. I think we do realize, and most corporates realize, that companies cannot be successful in a failing society. So, and I think we should not leave it to the government, to fix this. So we all have our responsibility as individuals, but also as companies. And I think that's clear. Once that's clear, then you can start looking for a methodology. I think the LEAP approach that I saw in your document is a rather good, way to do it. Think first, and before you start doing. I think you also have to consider to be brutally honest with yourself. Because there will be times that you have to do trade-offs, that you have to make decisions, which are sometimes financially less interesting, better for biodiversity. I think it's good to consider that before you get started, what the level of engagement is that you want, and then you need a certain formal process, to get it going and to make sure that in your company it doesn't depend on an individual or so that it's really embedded in everything you do. It's not a department. Sustainability is not a department. It's much broader. It covers every aspect of what you do, all the impacts that you have as a company. So I think recommendation, yes. I think first considering, and then look for a good a process with I think a recommendation to the one that you are elaborating, the framework that you have put out in this LEAP approach can definitely be of help.
Brilliant, thank you. We have got a couple of questions, and I do encourage you to post more if you have them. As we do have a company also here, just from the poll, that said they have already started including TNFD recommendations in their disclosures. I don't know if you're able to share some of the tools that you use, because that's always what we get asked in these webinars, is how do we start? How do we begin? What are the kind of tools that we can use? So we'd love to see that. Also, I'm going to just drop into the chat. Vic's just done it for my colleague. That's just our web page with the consultation group, and it mentions the other events we've had. And I say that because there's a question here: how would you recommend using the sector neutral and sector specific guidance for companies whose operations cross over into multiple areas, i.e. retailers selling both food and clothing? I don't know if our panelists have a thought on that, but last week we did host a webinar for energy and extractives, and BP joined us, and obviously they have, multiple different, they have obviously an oil and gas business, but they also sell a lot of coffee. So they were talking about how some of their approaches. So I mentioned that the recording is on our website, so you could go and watch that if you wanted to. But I don't know, Phil or Philip, if you have any comments on that one and how you might sort of start. It feels a bit early on, so feel free to say no comment. But is there anything you're looking at how you might look at neutral or sector broad or specific guidance? Phil, maybe I'll come to you. It sounds like you've picked cotton as the focus. Yeah,
I think again I'd come back to the risk assessment, which I think is a really important starting position to come from, because you've got to start somewhere, and I think you've got to tackle your key risks initially. As I say, that's enabled us to start building out a broader program. So we're starting to look at other sectors of our business, and we'll continue to do that. And that, but initially the risk assessment went across our entire business. So, we did that whole sweep to begin with. I think cotton clearly as an agricultural crop just stood out as a key risk, and as I say, it's our biggest raw material, so that was really where we wanted to focus our efforts. And having our own sustainable cotton program obviously presents us with a really unique opportunity to do some really exciting work on the ground. So again, it's really early stages at the moment, but as part of our Primark Cares commitments, we've also committed to move towards adopting more and more regenerative farming practices within this program, some of which we are already using. The farmers are already using some regenerative practices, but it's just to put a greater emphasis on that. And what we really are interested in doing is trying to find a correlation between improved biodiversity and more regenerative farming practices, because there's a very strong synergy there. So again, if we can evidence that scientifically, I think that will open up more opportunities in other parts of our business. So yes, I think it's early stages, but I think the risk assessment is a good place to begin looking at this.
Yeah, fantastic. Philip, anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, we're a bit on the other side. We're earlier in the chain, right? So what we do is try to provide solutions for companies like Primark who are looking for to improve their biodiversity. So we are looking at agro waste recycling. There's a lot of things that people are throwing away that can be made of use in textiles: banana skin, sugarcane, coffee grounds, nutshells, you name it. They all contain cellulose. So we can use that for our ionic. We're looking at seaweed farming. Seaweed contains cellulose as well. We have a very interesting project running where we make where bacteria make cellulose, bacterial cellulose. We look at sustainable pulp, which has been around for a while, and then we're also looking at post-consumer recycling of cotton, of jeans, right, and use that again as feedstock for new products. So we're on the let's say creative side to make sure that the industry, once they make the decision to to get going, that there are options, that we keep choice for consumers, because we do not want to have one material that everybody is using. We want to keep a variety in the offering, and that's a little bit our role, providing that those raw materials.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So yes, in answer to this question, how would you recommend using the sector neutral and sector specific guidance? I think what we could do is, when we put together with the help of KPMG the fact sheet that comes back to you, that might be something we can flag up in there. And it might be something that we learn also from how other sectors are looking at it. So just in response to that question, we'll take that away, but I would probably recommend looking at also a couple of the other webinars in different sectors. Something I did mention earlier is that Textile Exchange, who you may be familiar with, is running a pilot at the moment with TNFD, and we're going to be working with them on the more of a deep dive roundtable where we'll go into some of the specifics around the framework and the different standards and metrics are out there. So, and you can, just by signing up to this webinar, you'll get an email about that particular event if you wanted to get engaged, but you're also welcome to email us at the email that is in the chat, tnfdncg@gfi.green, or you can email me personally. It's helen.avery@gfi.green. There's another question here. Is it possible to join the NCG for companies outside of the UK? We're a fashion brand in Germany. I'm not sure if there is a national consultation group in Germany. I don't know if anyone on the call might be able to, I'm thinking of the team in the background might be able to find that out quickly before the end of this call. Obviously, you're welcome to join us and come. It's, there is an NCG in Switzerland, I'm pretty sure as well. But we can try and get the list of those to fill you in. And if we aren't able to do it in the next 10 minutes, we'll put it again in the pack that we send you and how you would join those. One that might be in your country specifically. But yes, you're very welcome here too. And then there's, will there be a software-based solution for the TNFD assessment available? I actually don't know. I know it's quite early days. It would be wonderful if there was. So I'm sure that's something they're working on. But again, we can take that away and ask the TNFD team. And we're hoping at the next roundtable that the TNFD team will actually be there too, so can answer some more technical questions. And then there is a question here for Phil. To analyse the key biodiversity risks and impact in a company like Primark, how much focus is needed to analyse local nature conditions at individual locations versus looking at a holistic perspective only? I think this is like that L in the LEAP process. So if you can comment on that.
Yes, I think, I mean, obviously you have to begin with a pretty broad sweep. So, utilising tools like the IBAT tool have really been helped to sort of map your material sourcing locations with areas of risk, and then start to look down into the detail a little bit more. So I think that sort of higher altitude view is really important to begin with. But then ultimately I think you do need to then get down into the detail, forgive the pun, at grassroots level, but then you really need to understand what the local nuances are in those areas where you're sourcing from. I mean, I think there's obviously some real opportunities to start building connectivity, building corridors for wildlife that can then ultimately connect into a broader landscape impact. And I think the opportunities for collaboration further on down the line will just help speed that up. But I think that the devil is in the detail, yes. And I think, again, I just emphasize the point to find those local experts. And often, it could be those local communities in many cases who know those regions better than anybody, and just go and talk to them. I mean, I went out to visit some of the cotton farms in September, talked to a lot of the farmers and the communities, and learnt an awful lot, even from just sort of ad hoc conversations about what's happening to biodiversity in their area. And that's hugely important before you then start to begin the scientific surveying. So yeah, I think that's really important to get to know the real detail and get out there, as I say, and get out in the field and find out what's actually going on.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks, Phil. And then I think we'll take this as a final question and then do a bit of a wrap up. Well, one, I wanted to just come back. The team says there isn't a national consultation group in Germany at present, but there is one in Switzerland and France and also the Netherlands. But obviously you're welcome to join us. And then there's a question here from Bex about remote sensing and satellite Earth observations. Always an interesting question. To what extent are either of you, maybe we'll start with you, Philip, are using those kinds of technologies?
Which technologies? I didn't get
It says
you.
satellite Earth observation techniques and remote sensing.
Yeah, well, not from our side. I do. One of the big challenges, and I guess also for Primark, is transparency, traceability, that kind of techie stuff, right? We know that the European Commission is working on a product identification tag, for you to be able to track back where the product is coming from, and also to see how recyclable or it is. So on the tech side, that's something that is quite interesting. But we are on a very basic, very early, position in the value chain. So that's not something that we are totally engaged with.
Yeah, probably less relevant to you. Sorry for picking on you first, Phil. No what about for Primark?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, we're at the stage where we're starting to evaluate some of those methodologies right now to see what's going to work best. So, I think you've touched earlier on some of the tools that are available, like the WWF Biodiversity Risk Filter, and there's others out there. IBAT I mentioned. I mean, they're great to get started with, but I think when it comes to surveying on the ground, then we're already starting to look at what methodologies are going to work, and we're going to try some out, because the only way to find out is to pilot them, and we're going to see what works best. Nobody's really done this, to my knowledge, in a cotton cultivation context before, so we're going to learn as we go, but we're going to employ a variety of techniques and try them out, and obviously review and then take those forward. I mean, I think somebody mentioned innovation earlier on, and I think that's going to be really key to the success of this kind of work going forward. If we're really going to scale this kind of surveying and measuring and then being able to report that, then we're going to need to have some really innovative techniques at our disposal. So I think this will develop, I'm sure, as it goes forward and move. There'll be a place for traditional surveying methodologies, but I think innovation will play a really important part as well.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm just squeezing this one quickly. Another one for you, Phil. Have you looked into disclosure too, i.e. if and how to disclose financial estimates of various biodiversity risks in your annual report yet?
Not at this stage, no. I think, again, it's probably too early, but I'm sure that'll be something we'll be considering down the line.
Brilliant. Thank you. Okay, well, we'll draw a line under the Q&A here. If you have more, of course, you can feel free to drop us an email and we'll try and answer them for you, or we'll send them out to people who can answer them. So just to recap again, and I'll hand over to Lauren in a moment who can give us a bit of a playback. March 28th, the final beta release is coming out. We will appreciate that there is a lot of documents to read for some of you starting this journey now, catching up on the frameworks. We'll try and provide a bit of a high-level overview, and also work on what are some things you want to be thinking about in that final release, so that will help you think about the feedback that you could be giving over that 60-day consultation period. Because, as I say, it would be wonderful this is a really great opportunity for you to feedback into this incredible framework, which may end up being mandated down the line. So with that, I'm just going to hand over to Lauren, who I mentioned is joining us from KPMG, for a bit of a wrap up, and then we'll give you a sign off at the end. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Helen. Pleasure to be here. As Helen noted, my name is Lauren Weatherden, and I'm Associate Director focusing on nature and biodiversity with KPMG, and we are delighted to be supporting GFI with these sessions. So as Helen noted, I'm just going to give a bit of a playback now in terms of some of the key messages that came out. But before I do that, just a big thanks to our speakers, to Andrew for giving an overview of the importance of the TNFD, to Phil and Philip for sharing their experiences, and of course to all of you for joining us today. So the first key thing that resonated for me was Andrew's description of nature as large-scale infrastructure that keeps the world safe, and that ultimately 100% of the economy is dependent on nature. And I think that's something that sort of plays in my mind quite often as we go through this process and try to find ways in which we can ensure that is sustained in the long run. And I think the other thing, just to quickly echo, is Helen's note around this being your chance. This really is a key opportunity to really feed in to ensure that you understand what the TNFD means for your business, for your sector, and also to ensure that it is meaningful as well for you as you embark on this journey. Our speakers have talked about where to start. Of course, it's not always easy, but the key thing that I really took away from this is identifying where biodiversity matters most for you in your business and where you'd like to intervene. So not necessarily tackling everything at once, but really focusing on those priority risks. And once you've done that, then you can start extending and embedding biodiversity across the business to establish that more holistic strategy. And again, also looking at not just the broader sustainability programs, but also how nature can help to deliver on climate ambitions as well as that other half of the coin. We've also heard from our speakers on the benefit of prioritizing a selection of raw materials or ingredients in the first instance. And again, focusing on those, I think what Phil described as the sharp end of those impacts. And so that could be, we've heard about the Sustainable Cotton Initiative or replacing synthetics with natural fibers. So again, finding those avenues in and then being able to take those lessons learned and apply it across the broader supply chain. So I think from this conversation and also some of the other ones that we've heard is about building those foundations and those relationships with suppliers. And also those local communities on the ground that was mentioned. So not just from a nature and climate perspective, but also a just transition perspective and learning as you go to have that local expertise. The good news is really that once you've identified those and prioritized those material areas, we've heard about the networks of partnerships that you can engage, those experts, both globally, nationally, and also locally. And this was something that really came out at COP15 in December. Companies were noting that there were many coalitions, basically the list is as long as there are commodities, who are able to help and support and provide those different lenses and also help with accessing the data, including that initial starting point that can include tools like IBAT, or I know the remote sensing was mentioned, and then getting into more into the data on the ground to ensure that you're looking not just at screening, but also then the actual attribution of outcomes of nature, beneficial outcomes for nature, I should say. So I'm sure many of you are already engaging with some of these, but hopefully that really is the key message is you do have support. And I think our speakers have really shown that there are many really knowledgeable companies who are on this journey, and a lot of knowledge sharing is going on at the moment and can also be facilitated through the TNFD process. So again, please feel free to get in touch with us if there are any questions, or to reach out to TNFD Network or Textile Exchange. And there's also the UK Business and Biodiversity Forum as well, who is quite active in this area. And Helen mentioned the one-pagers that will come out with also frequently asked questions that hopefully will support. And just a quick note on those roundtables, again, if that is of interest, please do let us know. And with that, I will hand it back to Helen.
Thank you, Lauren. Well, that's it from us. 2 minutes back of your lunchtime. Really thank you to Phil and Philip. We appreciate it's such an early journey, and so we're just so grateful for anyone who's willing to come and just share even about that early journey. So thank you both for your time today, and thank you as ever to Andrew. As Lauren mentioned, we're so grateful to have you here. And so we'll be back in touch with the one-pager, the recording, and the slides. You can find it all as well on the website that we've got in the links, and feel free to reach out at any point.